I want to then shift our theme a little bit towards the ecological. The questions of climate governance, climate change, Anthropocene, post-Anthropocene ecosystems, inclusive of human societies, ecosystems exclusive of them, has been obviously a theme that all of the projects up till now have been touching on one way or another. But we'd like to enter into these questions a little bit more directly, both in the sense to which the question of ecosystem governance may be really the primary, most important question for planetary governance to conceive, but also the ways in which the questions of ecological governance may come to constitute or becomes a lens by which we would see any number of other issues of planetary governance inside of it. In a certain sense, this might be the direction that we would pursue, rather than the ecosystem as an object of governance, the governance as a component of ecosystem self-composition. Our next speaker, someone who's been involved with the program, with the Terraforming program since the beginning, is someone whose work and expertise on exactly this question of ecosystem self-composition will be really important for us to hear from. That is Holly Jean Buck, who was the author of a book that I thought was really one of the most interesting books of 2019, a book called After Geoengineering: Climate, Tragedy, Repair, and Restoration. It's a book on a kind of left argument for a certain kind of geoengineering, but the approach is right there in the subtitle: Tragedy, Repair, and Restoration. Her research areas involve, for everything from science technology studies to global economic governance, but a lot of her work is really focused around these themes that I've just elucidated. How is it that geotechnologies and geopractices, and I think in her work, these combine and interlace in really important ways, would move us not just towards a carbon zero, but really beyond net zero, not only as a metric, but net zero as a kind of conceptual framework for how to think about governance, eco-governance as an accounting problem. And really, are there possibilities for kind of massive international, planetary scale intervention in the climate that have democratic effects, decentralized effects, that are participatory, that are publicly owned and controlled in the ways in which they might need to be, or at least have those effects? And I think that means-end relationship is one that she's particularly adept at clarifying for us. Her work is, as I see it, driven by a very, enormously refreshing and imaginative, sober pragmatism, but really about the need for a public ownership, control, and direction for carbon infrastructures more generally. And indeed, once more, not just that these would be an object of governance, but these would be a medium through which an ecosystem more generally composes itself, inside of which much all of the factors and variables in an industrial society to be located. So in addition to that book, the After Geoengineering book, she's also the co-author with J.P. Spinski and Andres Malm, a book which came out from Rutgers called Has It Come to This? The Promise and Peril of Geoengineering on the Brink. She's currently assistant professor of environment sustainability at University of Buffalo. And with that, I pass it to our next speaker, Holly Jean Buck.
Hi. It's been so great to hear about your projects, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the rest of them. I'm going to talk for 15 minutes about net zero, knowing that net zero in itself is kind of a boring thing, but it's really important. So I hope that after 2 hours of Zoom, we can keep going with this for 15 minutes, because I'm talking about it because it's the frame right now for governance of climate change, right? All these countries and companies and cities have announced these net zero targets. And net zero at its best is the dream of a world in balance. It means that there's some amount of positive residual emissions that are balanced by some amount of carbon removals. And already, I mean, speaking on the theme of models governing things, these integrated assessment models that have come up with scenarios illustrated so well by Glenn Peters, who does the public service of trying to interpret these on Twitter for people. They're already governing how people are thinking about the problem, and they're going to have material effects. So we're at the point where, you know, the models say we need 10 gigatons of removal, you can buy the 10 gigaton hoodie. It's that level, and the next level will be kind of projects that are aimed at the scale. So there are these questions: how many remaining positive emissions? How many removals? Is it really 10 gigatons? Where do these emissions come from, the remaining ones? Where do the removals place them in the end? All of that is to be decided. And if we're going to truly respond to climate change, the climate politics of the 2020s is going to be about hashing out these questions. And so on April 29th, there was this German court ruling that actually found that net zero by 2050 targets were too vague. They put too much burden on the future. And Germany's getting more specific about kind of interim targets. And The Economist, writing about this, says that voters and activists, quote, must insist on good faith estimates of the negative emissions governments are banking on. That way they can tell if they are feasible and see what cuts will be needed in 5, 10, or 15 years' time, end quote. So calling for this type of information isn't radical, it's very basic, like economist level basic. And one of the big issues coming up here is that the supply of residual emissions will outstrip the supply of removals. That is, removals are going to be scarce because of demands on land and energy. And those constraints are flexible and they have yet to be explored, but there will be a limit to them. And so you don't want emissions from something like a coal plant or a private jet claiming those scarce removals. You want things that are truly hard to decarbonize, like aviation for everybody or fertilizer production, a few other things to get those removals. And this requires a level of governance that we don't currently have. But I want to put those political questions on hold for now and turn to a more fundamental matter, which is, can we know if we've reached net zero? If so, how will we know? And net zero implies that we have information architectures for at least 3 things. First, that we know residual emissions. So some emissions are fugitive, right? Kind of these lawless criminal emissions. Fugitive emissions from fossil fuel production currently comprise nearly 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions, including flaring. So, you know, emissions should be governable, but aren't adequately governed at the moment. Net zero, secondly, also demands that we know removals. So there's various ways to capture carbon. There's industrial techniques for geologic storage, like direct air capture or bioenergy paired with carbon capture and storage. And those should be knowable because it involves injecting CO2 underground. So at least you should be able to measure how much you inject. Although if you talk to geologists, it can be a bit complicated to track where that CO2 actually ends up in the rock. But it seems doable, right? And then there's techniques like enhanced mineral weathering or ocean fertilization that are much more challenging to know, especially when dealing with deep oceans or long timescales. Then there's also ecosystem-based approaches like afforestation, soil carbon sequestration. It should be able to track those sorts of removals, for example, with remote sensing, new tools for forest carbon monitoring. But it's not easy. And in fact, there was a paper that came out a few weeks ago that pointed out a very specific issue with more macro scale knowledge of removals. And so I'm going to talk about it for a minute, even though it seems wonky at first. We know that the world's land surface absorbs 1/3 of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. But the models that are used in these decarbonization pathways, like I was talking about earlier, they give one number for the size of the carbon sink. for the carbon that's removed by forests, and et cetera. But if you look at what nation states are reporting in their country level inventories, you get a different number. And so this paper found that there's a 5.5 gigaton of CO2 mismatch between these models and what countries are reporting that they're removing with their forests. So with greenhouse gas emissions about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, that's a big gap. It's like a 10% gap or more, right? And so you have this mismatch because you have two communities producing knowledge about this. The modelers are counting what's managed forests differently than countries do. So, okay, that's a wonky accounting issue. Who cares? But it's important because countries are claiming big reductions to their annual emissions because of the forests they have. So you can't actually evaluate very well if they're making progress on their climate goals. It's an issue about who gets credit for these removals and how that's affecting the goalposts for climate action. So the US reports 6.6 billion tons of CO2 emissions right now, but subtracts 789 million because of their land six. And so what I'm saying here is basically how you count this stuff matters for the outcomes. It's not just in having the tech for counting the satellites or the LiDAR or soil monitors or whatever, the hardware and the software. It's actually also having made the right choices about the framework which those measurements go into. And net zero is also demanding that we have a mechanism for matching up these residual emissions and these removals. And this really requires a planetary scale system. You can't have each country and city reaching net zero and that adding up to a net zero world, but really the capacities of each place to cut emissions and generate removals are different. So if you want to use the flexibility of net zero, you need to be able to have some exchanges across space and across sectors. So, well, you can see that, you know, there's politics and all of that. You can also see that the information data, the platforms for monitoring and exchanging, et cetera, is really critical to the success. And in some ways it is the success. And here you have designing these. Here's a slide from PricewaterhouseCoopers in their climate tech report. They have kind of these 7 pillars, 5 kind of vertical pillars of climate tech, and then 2 horizontal ones supporting all of this. And the investment going into climate and earth data generation from VC is actually very small compared to, you know, mobility and transport, food and ag. Just 1.1 billion of venture capital deployed between 2013 and 2019. So that's actually, you know, it makes you wonder who's really actually trying to build this monitoring climate and earth data infrastructure. I mean, is it going to be built? I wonder about why that's not bigger personally. But there are some startups, right? This is from an analyst on the internet who has made a nice typology of the type of climate tech startups that are dealing with software. And you could see this as like, wow, there's a big ecosystem, but I mean, in reality, I would imagine that a lot of these will exit, they'll get bought by big companies, and eventually you have a few platforms and possibly the big 4 accounting firms like Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, you know, it'll be in kind of the purview of either big tech or big accounting, right? And people are reflexively resisting all of this, I think. They say, you know, this hasn't worked, this is the man, this is the big accounting trick. But a lot of times critics don't have a clear framework for replacing net zero. Personally, I don't think net zero is a very good ultimate goal. I think a non-fossil economy with abundant renewables and green hydrogen is like the end of century vision. And there's a lot of other goals around biodiversity, water, social justice, et cetera, that are equally critical. The point of net zero in mid-century as an object of governance and a framework for governance is to create flexibility in the energy transition. it's not enough on its own. We also need a plan for phasing out fossil fuels. And all of that requires some amount of expert planning. But we've been caught in this binary where technocracy is the man in the suit from, previous decades, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? And then this kind of countercultural movement against that. So the man in the suit, bureaucracy, the bomb, versus decentralization of expertise, non-hierarchy, localism. And now we're finally seeing the kind of post-truth side of that other side of the binary. So what do? I mean, I think we need to get rid of this whole binary between the technocratic faceless experts and the joyous localized lay people. And we shouldn't be calling for a return to a big science that was always flawed, or, burying ourselves in this non-diverse neoliberal architecture that has become the science in the wake of COVID. The science we need has never actually existed, I don't think. It's a future tense thing to be made. And so we can see the problems in where we're headed with the kind of default architectures that are coming up. I mean, this is just news in the past, couple of months, right? I'm not going to go into all of these examples, but they're good ones. One of these is a study that identified methodologies for modeling the deforestation that would have happened in the absence of offset projects involving how airlines are doing offsets. Another looked at what's going on with pretty wonky choices in calculating averages in California's forest offset scheme done by Carbon Plan, which is a group I really recommend everybody check out their work, because they're working on this. How do you make this stuff open source? And then obviously the failure of the grid in Texas with the winter storms, and the situation in the US right now with this pipeline that went offline. These look like really different problems, and they are different, but each of them has elements of poor modeling, poor choices in the information architecture, in some cases compounded by failing to act on things that your predictive modeling and your analysis has already told you is going to be a problem. So in the case of this pipeline, I won't go deeply into it, but there is a report by a government office in 2019 that indicated that the Transportation Security Administration had just 6 staffers responsible for pipeline security. So, I mean, if you're in the US, you might know how absurd it is that that agency would even be in charge of this. But, this is in a world where we know that pipelines are vulnerable infrastructure. So I'm not trying to say that the platforms are everything. The acting on what platforms is telling you is also really important. But this is kind of the de facto governance we have right now, is various platforms. When you're thinking about emissions and removals and who is in between all of that, I think it would be great if actually the state had a role and was allocating permits to emit and could deal with this problem of who in what sector, what entity gets the residual emissions. But we don't have that. It doesn't seem politically feasible right now. So platforms are de facto governance. And so what do we do? I mean, what if people had a say in planning this infrastructure, not just the physical infrastructure of forests and pipelines and transmission lines, but the informational infrastructure? Through that, they may actually be able to influence what's done. And there's an expertise on the ground that would catch some of the problems that I just referred to in these 4 examples. Right now, people don't tend to see the public as being made up of experts themselves, but publics really are a knowledge resource that can improve things. And in the case of Carbon Plan, or the analysts that caught some of these forest carbon mistakes working with Greenpeace, I mean, that's because the system is actually self-correcting in some ways, not as far as it needs to be. But I mean, this is my last slide, thinking about how do we build in publics into the design of net zero information infrastructure. The first step is to imagine what a net zero architecture designed in the public interest might be like. And here I'm focusing on carbon removal for the sake of narrowing the scope. On a basic level, open data for carbon removal, public platforms for monitoring, which is critical for trust. But a lot of people might stop at that basic level, say, okay, it's transparent, that's enough. I think we have to go beyond this demand for transparency towards some of these other things that might translate into material changes, like public say in the governance of the platforms, how they're designed, public ownership of the data and the profits that come from that data. So treating this data about geology, forests, soils, the planet's data as a communal resource, which people can use for different aims, such as having say in the decision-making about the policies and technologies. So the platforms can help with this because you can't advocate for a particular policy or pathway if you don't have the data to model its implications, both good and bad. Finally, possibly influencing public ownership of carbon removal infrastructure and projects. So all of that is super ambitious, but the risks are this attempt at net zero that's not trusted, that's gamed by various actors, that's essentially becomes lawless and ultimately fails. So hopefully we can move towards some of these steps. I look forward to discussing this with any of you. Please feel free to email me or follow up at any time.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Holly. It's excellent as always. Lots of food for thought. I'm going to go through this and recording in a little bit of detail, the notes. Yeah, it's this dynamic. I mean, as you know, in our program, this dynamic between states and platforms, the de facto and de jure modes of planning sovereignty and control over these things is a kind of conundrum that we always unpack at the core of things. There's a couple questions on the chat. I'd like, we're on times for, we want to keep things moving, but I wonder if you've entertained some of them. One of them has to do with something that you raised about I think what you call fugitive emissions, which is an interesting idea, but the problem of accuracy in the measurements of this as well, where there's where we may have this kind of difficult situation where the development of a proper carbon economics that is based on sensing and modeling would in a way incentivize black carbon emissions, or incentivize the economics of this in ways that would end up having all the wrong kinds of effects. And I wonder if you could, I think the idea of the question took a little bit more about that. The other question, and please take this in whatever order you like, had to do with, I think the limitations of optimize for carbon as the core metric here. I mean, obviously carbon, we need, the material reality of the planetary geochemistry, the removal of the carbon, turning down the temperature, all this is a kind of non-negotiable. But the question, I think, is like, what other metrics should we be looking at besides this? That might be relevant in terms of the kind of perhaps the political or social infrastructures that need to be put in place for this. And so 2 questions that come at the question of metrics from somewhat different angles. And I wonder if you have thoughts on those.
Yeah, I mean, on this second question about optimizing for carbon, I think this is a huge problem. But I talk about it because this is what, people are developing. That's where some investment is going. And I think one way to think of it is kind of like a beta test or a pilot for working out some of the things that we will want to do for a whole bunch of other parameters. So, I mean, you can think about elements, you can think about nitrogen and, the nitrogen cycle and all the pollution going into waterways. You can think about sulfur and air pollution. I mean, I'm not saying we should just focus on elements, but you do that for different aspects of the system. You think about biodiversity. I mean, I think the best framework we have for the question of what we should be optimizing for is the sustainable development goals, because that went through such an intensive consensus process where all these different groups weighed in on what the goals should be. So even though they might feel like bureaucratic or something at this point. I think they're actually a great tool for telling us what are all the things we need to be thinking about. And then on the first question, does developing this monitoring infrastructure incentivize the wrong things? I think that, yeah, we've seen examples of that, especially in kind of the offset space. So I think that the key is to build a better infrastructure by having more diverse people included, by it not coming from a capitalist framework.